Hi there, welcome back. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's begin. The factory roared with life, its machines pounding out a relentless rhythm, drowning out all other sound. Conveyor belts whirred, gears clanked, and steam hissed from unseen vents. The scent of metal, oil, and sweat clung to the air, thick and unyielding. The workers moved in a synchronized routine, their motions mechanical, their eyes dulled by repetition. Among them was Elias. He stood at his station, hands rough from years of labor, his posture slightly hunched from long hours at the assembly line. His uniform was the same as everyone else's, faded blue, stained with grease, but his mind was elsewhere. His fingers worked automatically, placing pieces onto the belt, tightening bolts, lifting heavy materials. It was what he had done every day for years. It was what he would do tomorrow. But in the spaces between each movement, in the brief pauses where monotony took hold, Elias saw something else. He saw his body moving differently, not in the rigid, repetitive motions of factory work, but with fluidity, with grace. He could almost feel the rhythm of another world, one not dictated by machinery but by something deeper, something unseen. The moment the shift ended, Elias wiped his hands on his trousers, collected his things, and walked out without a word. He never lingered in the break room like the others, never stayed to chat in the parking lot. The city's neon lights flickered in the distance as he walked, the cool air brushing against his face. But he didn't go home. Instead, he took a different route, one that led to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building had long been forgotten, its windows cracked, its doors barely holding onto their hinges. But inside, beneath the towering ceiling and exposed beams, the air was different. It was open. It belonged to him. Elias placed an old radio on the floor, its antenna bent, its buttons worn smooth. He turned the dial carefully, searching through static, until a faint melody broke through. It was quiet, almost hesitant, but it was enough, and then he moved. At first, it was a simple shift of weight, a slow sway from side to side. His limbs ached from the day's work, his muscles stiff from standing still for so long, but he pushed through it. He stepped forward, then back. A turn, a lift, each motion carved through the stillness, painting invisible patterns onto the dusty floor. He had no teacher, no audience, only the sound of his own breath, the worn-out melody from the radio, and the feeling in his chest, something deep, something that refused to stay quiet. He practiced until his legs burned, until his arms felt like lead, but exhaustion wasn't the enemy here. It was just another thing to move through. Then, just as he was about to stop, he heard it, a sound that did not belong to the night. A faint creak, a footstep. Elias froze. His breath came fast. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. The warehouse was supposed to be empty. His chest tightened as he turned toward the shadows, scanning the dimly lit space. Nothing. Just the wind, he told himself. Just the building settling. But as he gathered his things, a thought refused to leave him. What if someone had seen him? Elias didn't return to the warehouse the next night. For the first time in months, he walked straight home after his shift, his boots scuffing against the pavement in an unsteady rhythm. The feeling sat heavy in his stomach, a strange unease that he couldn't quite shake. What if someone had been watching? What if a worker from the factory had followed him, curious about where he disappeared to every night? The thought made his hands clench into fists. Inside his small apartment, the silence pressed against him. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, just a table, a chair, and a mattress in the corner. He dropped his work bag by the door and sat down, staring at his hands. They were calloused, fingers roughened by years of labor, hands built for lifting, tightening, assembling, not for the kind of movement he craved. For hours he sat in stillness, listening to the distant hum of the city beyond his window. His body ached, not from work, but from something deeper, an absence, and emptiness. 2 nights passed before he returned. When he did, it was with hesitation. He paused at the warehouse door, listening. The wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, rattling a loose sheet of metal somewhere in the distance. He exhaled, pushing open the door. The warehouse was just as he had left it, silent, waiting. The radio was still there, resting on the dusty floor. He turned it on. The music crackled through the speakers, and Elias closed his eyes, letting it settle into his bones. The first few steps were careful, cautious. His muscles resisted at first, stiff from the days of stillness. But as he moved, the hesitation melted away. His feet glided across the concrete, his arms cut through the air. The rhythm found him again quiet, but insistent. He danced, and for a while, nothing else existed. Then, a sound, not the wind, not the building shifting, something closer. Elias stopped, mid-motion, his breath catching in his throat. He turned sharply toward the entrance, heart pounding. The shadows seemed to shift, just for a moment. And then, footsteps, slow, measured. Someone was there. A figure stepped forward, emerging from the darkness. A girl, no older than 20, with a hood pulled over her head, her hands stuffed into the pockets of a worn-out jacket. Her gaze was steady, unreadable. She had been watching. Elias's first instinct was to run, but his feet stayed planted. The girl tilted her head slightly, as if considering something, then spoke. "You're good." Her voice was quiet, almost lost in the vastness of the space. Elias said nothing. He couldn't. His throat was tight, his mind racing. How long had she been there? How much had she seen? She didn't wait for an answer. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked away, disappearing into the night as silently as she had come. Elias stood frozen, listening to the echo of her footsteps fading into the distance. For the first time since he had started dancing, he wasn't alone. Elias didn't dance that night. He stood in the warehouse long after the girl had disappeared, staring at the empty space she had occupied. The weight of her words pressed against him. Simple, direct. "You're good." Good at what? Moving alone. In an abandoned building, like a ghost. Pretending that what he did here mattered? He turned off the radio, the silence settling in like dust. Then, with slow, measured steps, he left. The next day at the factory, his hands worked as they always did, lifting, assembling, tightening. But his mind was restless. The machines droned in their steady rhythm, but beneath it, he kept hearing her voice. "You're good." A compliment, a statement, a fact. It gnawed at him. By the time his shift ended, his legs were already moving before his mind could catch up. He needed to go back. He needed to know if she would be there again. The warehouse stood, as it always had, silent, waiting. He pushed the door open, stepping inside, half expecting to see her in the shadows, but he was alone. Relief and disappointment twisted together in his chest. He shook his head, turning toward the radio. Maybe he had imagined her. Maybe the long nights had finally gotten to him. He turned the dial, searching through static, music. He exhaled. Then, a sound, a soft scrape of a shoe against concrete. Elias stiffened. He didn't turn immediately. He let the music play, let the moment stretch. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head. She was there, standing near the entrance, hood up, hands still tucked into her pockets, watching. Elias stared. She stared back. Neither moved. Then, to his surprise, she did something unexpected. She walked forward, not much, just a few steps. Enough to show she wasn't leaving. Enough to show she was waiting. Elias swallowed, feeling his pulse in his throat. He didn't know what she wanted. He didn't know why she was here. But something about her presence didn't feel threatening. It felt like a challenge, a breath, a decision. Elias pressed play. And this time, he danced with his eyes open. He didn't pretend she wasn't there. He let her watch. The music filled the warehouse, a slow, steady pulse that carried through the empty space. Elias moved, not as he had before, hidden in the comfort of solitude, but with the weight of an audience, however small. His body resisted at first, stiff with hesitation. But he kept going, step after step, turn after turn, his limbs loosened, the rhythm guiding him forward. The girl watched. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, eyes fixed on him, as if she were studying something fragile, something that might disappear if she blinked. Elias tried to ignore her, tried to lose himself in the movement, but it was impossible. He wasn't used to being seen. The pressure settled deep in his chest, turning every step into something heavier. Then he faltered. A misstep, barely noticeable. But he felt it. His foot dragged against the concrete, and the flow of movement broke. A sharp inhale, a hesitation. He stopped. The music played on, but Elias stood still, breath uneven, heart pounding. He swallowed, his gaze dropping to the floor. A mistake. The girl's voice cut through the silence. "Why'd you stop?" Elias tensed. He didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did, but saying it out loud would make it real. Because I messed up. Because you're watching. Because I don't know how to dance when I'm not alone. The words stayed trapped in his throat. She exhaled sharply, a sound somewhere between amusement and impatience. "That was nothing," she said, shaking her head. "Keep going." Elias hesitated, but she didn't look away. He could have left, could have grabbed his things and walked out, let the moment slip away. But instead, he took a step forward. Then another, and then he danced again. The misstep didn't matter. The weight of her gaze didn't crush him. He moved, and for the first time, he wasn't just dancing for himself. The music pulsed through the warehouse, filling the empty space between them. Elias moved, not perfectly, not without hesitation, but he moved. The girl still watched, her expression unreadable, her stance relaxed but unwavering. The rhythm carried him, and this time he didn't let his missteps stop him. His foot caught on the rough concrete once, his balance wavered during a turn, but he pushed through. The instinct to stop, to retreat, lingered at the edge of his mind, but her words echoed louder. That was nothing. Keep going. So he did. By the time the song faded into silence, his breath was uneven, his body warm with exertion. He straightened, rolling his shoulders, unsure of what to expect now. The girl tilted her head slightly, studying him. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. Elias wasn't sure why, but something about that small gesture settled the tightness in his chest. She turned without another word, heading for the door. "Wait." The word was out before he could stop it. She glanced back. Elias hesitated. He wasn't even sure what he was asking for. He just knew that he didn't want this to end in silence. He cleared his throat. "Why are you watching me?" The girl raised an eyebrow, as if the question was strange to her. Then, with a shrug, she answered, "Why are you dancing?" Elias opened his mouth, but no words came. Why was he dancing? The factory, the long shifts, the weight of routine pressing down on him. It was easy to say that he danced to escape all of that, but there was something more, something deeper. The girl didn't wait for an answer. She turned, hands in her pockets, and disappeared into the night. Elias stood there, her question echoing in his mind. He didn't have an answer, but he knew he had to find one. Elias couldn't stop thinking about her question. "Why are you dancing?" The factory was louder than ever the next day. The machines seemed to demand more of him with each passing hour, the clanging metal, the buzz of the conveyor belts, the endless cycle of work. But his mind was far from the factory floor. He was back in the warehouse, dancing under the flickering light, the girl's eyes following every movement, her question hanging in the air like an unfinished sentence. Why was he dancing? He wasn't sure. He had never stopped to question it before. It had always been something he did in the quiet, in the privacy of that old warehouse where nobody knew him, where nobody expected anything. He danced because it felt right, because it gave him a moment to feel like he wasn't just a worker, a machine in the system, just another nameless face in the crowd. But was that enough? His hands trembled slightly as he tightened a bolt on the assembly line. The factory was the only place that had ever felt familiar to him. It was where he belonged. Or at least, that's what he told himself. He had never dreamed of anything else. But now, something inside him had shifted. The question lingered, pulling at him with an intensity he couldn't ignore. When his shift ended, he walked out of the factory without hesitation. He didn't go straight home. He didn't walk past the usual street corners or head down the right, familiar alleys. Instead, he walked to the warehouse again. The door creaked as he opened it, and for a moment, the silence felt oppressive. He stepped inside, waiting for the rush of music, the comfort of movement. But the air felt different this time, as though the space was holding its breath. He didn't touch the radio immediately. Instead, he stood there in the middle of the IHA room, letting the quiet stretch out before him. He thought about the girl. What did she see in him? What did she want from him? Why did she care? And what did it mean that he cared? Elias closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. Then he pressed play. The melody was slow at first, gentle, almost coaxing him to move. He let it wash over him, his muscles loosening, his feet finding their rhythm. Each step was deliberate, measured. His body moved in a way it never had before, less like a machine and more like a conversation, an exchange. He was aware of the space around him, of how the floor felt beneath his feet, how the air moved with every turn, every sway. And for the first time, he didn't just dance because he had to. He danced because it felt like an answer to a question. He hadn't known how to ask. The music swelled, and Elias moved with it. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear. And when he finished, when the final note faded into silence, he felt different, stronger, more whole. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. Elias spent the next few nights dancing like he never had before. The warehouse became his sanctuary, a place where questions floated in the air, unanswered yet not urgent. Each movement he made, no matter how small, felt like an exploration of himself, of his body, of the space that seemed to open up around him. He stopped questioning the why. He didn't need to. The rhythm spoke for him. His body had a language of its own, one that didn't need to be explained. But there was a part of him, a small, persistent voice, that still asked, "What comes next?" It wasn't enough to just dance. He needed something more. The warehouse had given him space. The factory had given him structure, but neither felt like a complete life. His hands, so accustomed to assembly and labor, wanted something else, something more expressive, more fluid. His feet, used to the solid ground of factory floors, craved the freedom to move without constraint. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the next step, but there was one thing he knew for certain. He couldn't go back. He couldn't pretend anymore that this was just a passing thing, a fleeting escape. One evening, as Elias was leaving the factory, he heard a familiar voice. "Hey, Elias?" He turned, startled. It was the girl from the warehouse. She stood a few feet away, her hands stuffed into her pockets again, her eyes scanning him. As if measuring the space between them, Elias felt his heart beat a little faster. He hadn't expected to see her here, not in the streets outside the factory, but there she was. "Are you following me?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but he could hear the edge of uncertainty in his own voice. She didn't answer immediately. She just tilted, her head slightly, looking him over with that same intense gaze. Then she shrugged. "Maybe," she said, her tone not unkind. He shifted uncomfortably, his hand running through his hair. "What do you want?" She took a step closer, close enough for him to see the faint smudge of paint on her jeans, the scuff on her boots. She was real, grounded, not some figment of his late-night reverie. "I want to know why you dance," she said, her voice calm but expectant. Elias blinked. "Why do you care?" he asked, his words coming out, sharper than he intended. She seemed unfazed, her gaze steady. "Because I saw something in you," she replied. "And I think you don't see it yet." Elias swallowed, unsure how to respond. The girl studied him for a moment longer, before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod. Don't forget, she said. You don't have to do it alone. And just like that, she turned and walked away, blending into the evening shadows, leaving Elias standing in the street, her words hanging in the cool night air. For the first time in days, Elias felt a twinge of uncertainty. What did she mean by that? Was she talking about the dance? Or was there something else, something he still wasn't seeing? He stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she had disappeared, trying to make sense of it all. Then, without another word, he started walking. Not home, not back to the warehouse, but somewhere else. Somewhere he hadn't dared to consider yet. He didn't know how he was going to get there, but he knew he had to try. The next day, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't the factory, it wasn't the movements he made there, the endless routine of machines and assembly. It wasn't even the warehouse, with its quiet corners and dusty air where he could dance in solitude. No, what had shifted was something much bigger than either of those places. The girl's words echoed in his mind, over and over again. You don't have to do it alone. He wasn't sure what it meant, not fully, but it felt like a door had opened, and for the first time he could see something beyond his own small world. At lunch he sat at his usual table, picking at his food absent-mindedly. His mind kept wandering to the evening, to the moment when she had stopped him on the street. She hadn't given him answers, no neat little explanations about why he danced, no promises of a new life. But she had given him something more important, an invitation to see more, to explore beyond the factory walls, beyond the quiet of the warehouse. And as much as Elias tried to ignore it, he knew he couldn't just pretend it wasn't there. He had to act on it. He had to find out what this new feeling meant. That evening, after his shift, he didn't go straight to the warehouse. Instead, he headed in the opposite direction toward the part of the city he hadn't visited in years, the part where people lived in smaller apartments, where the streets were lit with neon signs and the sound of laughter drifted out of open windows. It was a world he hadn't belonged to, not really. The factory had always been his world, the machines and the steady rhythm of work. But tonight it was different. Tonight he was looking for something else. Elias walked through the unfamiliar streets, his steps slow, unsure. He had no destination in mind, just a vague sense that this was the right thing to do. The further he went, the more he felt like an outsider in this vibrant, chaotic place. But there was also a spark of excitement, something that made his heart beat a little faster with each passing block, and then he saw it. A small dance studio, tucked between a cafe and an old bookstore. The windows were fogged up from the warmth inside, but through the glass he could see the faint silhouette of people moving in rhythm. It was a different world from the factory, from the warehouse. It was alive, full of energy. Elias stopped, in front of the door, his hand hovering over the handle. His heart pounded in his chest, and he realized how ridiculous it was. He had no business being here, no reason to step into this world. He wasn't a dancer. He wasn't one of them. But then he remembered her words again. You don't have to do it alone. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The bell above the door rang softly as he entered, and the sound of music immediately enveloped him. The studio was small but warm, filled with people of all shapes and sizes, their bodies moving fluidly across the floor. The air was thick with energy, with purpose. And in the middle of it all was a woman, a teacher, who was guiding them through a series of steps. She caught sight of Elias standing by the door, hesitant, unsure. Her eyes softened, and with a friendly smile she waved him over. First time? She asked, her voice calm but welcoming. Elias nodded, a little sheepish. I'm not sure if I belong here. She stepped closer, her expression encouraging. Everyone starts somewhere. Come join us. Elias stood frozen for a moment, the fear rising in his chest again, the familiar voice telling him to walk away. But this time, he didn't listen. He took a step forward, then another, and before he knew it, he was among them, among the dancers, moving not just in rhythm, but in a sense of belonging. Elias's body was out of sync at first. The others moved with practiced ease, fluid in their motions, while he stumbled through the steps, awkward and unsure. But there was something about the way the music wrapped around him, something about the way the teacher's calm direction shaped his movements that made him want to try. It was nothing like the lonely, solitary dancing in the warehouse. This was real. This was with people, with strangers who didn't care about his past, his mistakes, his doubts. They were just here to dance, to feel the music. He moved slowly at first, stumbling over each step, the beat slipping away from him as he tried to catch up. But there was no judgment here, no cold eyes on him as there had been when he first danced in the warehouse. There was only warmth, encouragement, and a steady rhythm that he tried to follow, even if it meant he wasn't perfect. The teacher came over a few times, adjusting his posture, guiding his arms into the right position, showing him where his weight should be. She was patient, understanding, as if she knew this wasn't about being perfect. It was about finding a way to belong. As the class went on, Elias's confidence started to build. His movements became more sure, less mechanical, as if the body he had kept hidden away for so long was starting to remember itself, starting to speak the language of dance instead of labor. The music swelled, and he felt a rush, one that had nothing to do with work, nothing to do with survival. It was just about the moment, about being here, about doing something he had never thought possible. At the end of the session, the teacher clapped her hands, signaling the end of the class. Elias stood there panting, his heart racing, the heat of the room still lingering on his skin. The other dancers were stretching, chatting with each other, but Elias remained where he was, feeling the ground beneath his feet, grounding himself in the realization of what he had just done. "You did well tonight," the teacher said, coming up to him with a smile. "You've got a lot of potential." Elias felt a small smile tug at his lips. He wasn't sure if he believed it, but it felt good to hear. "Thanks," he muttered, still unsure of himself. But something had shifted. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He had stepped into this world, unsure and uncertain, and now he felt a part of it. "You should come back," the teacher said, "and we have classes every week. You're welcome here any time." Elias nodded, his hands trembling slightly from the exertion, but there was something in his chest that felt light. "Yeah," he said, his voice a little steadier than before. "I think I will." As he left the studio that evening, the city streets felt different, less intimidating. The factory, the warehouse, all of it felt a little further away, and yet somehow more connected, like pieces of a puzzle he was slowly starting to put together. He had stepped out of his comfort zone, and it had been hard, so much harder than he had expected. But now there was a door open to him that he hadn't even known existed. The world felt bigger now, not just the factory or the warehouse or even the little studio. The world felt full of possibility, full of space for someone like him to exist in, and he wasn't going to let fear stop him from taking up that space. Not anymore. The next week, Elias returned to the studio, and the week after that, and the week after that. Each time he felt himself grow stronger, more confident, more at home in his own body. The dance no longer felt like an escape from the real life he had built. It felt like a path forward, a way to shape something new. Each time he danced, he left behind a piece of the man who had only ever known hard work, only ever known machines. He became something more than that, something with a new language, a new rhythm, a new purpose. And with each step, each movement, Elias was learning that the answer to the question he had been asking, "Why do I dance?" was unfolding before him in ways he could never have imagined. As weeks turned into months, Elias's life began to change in ways he had never anticipated. He still worked at the factory, still labored among the machines, but now there was something else in his world, something that had once seemed impossible to him. The studio, the dancers, the music, they had become part of him, woven into the fabric of his daily life. He had gone from stumbling through the steps to moving with a kind of ease that surprised even him. His movements were no longer tentative, no longer uncertain. There was strength in every turn, in every leap. The factory floor, once the only place where he felt he belonged, had become just a part of his larger world. It was still where he made his living, still where he earned his keep, but now it felt like just one chapter in a much larger story. He didn't tell anyone at work about the dance classes. It wasn't something he wanted to share, not yet anyway. There was a quiet pride in it, a secret joy that he wanted to hold on to, just for himself. He didn't need their approval, didn't need their questions or doubts. What mattered was how it made him feel when he was in that studio, when he was moving, when he was dancing. But sometimes, when he looked in the mirror in the early mornings, before he left for work, he saw something different in his reflection. His shoulders were broader, his posture straighter. There was a quiet confidence in the way he held himself that had never been there before. The factory, the warehouse, the studio, they were all parts of him, different sides of the same man. And for the first time, he didn't feel like he was trapped in any one of them. One evening, after another grueling shift at the factory, Elias was walking home, his mind wandering as usual. It had been a long day, the machines had been louder than usual, and the weight of the work had left him tired. But as he neared the familiar alley leading to the warehouse, something made him stop. A familiar sound reached his ears, a low, steady beat. He turned down the alley, his curiosity piqued, and found himself standing in front of the warehouse once more. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack he could see the dim light and hear the rhythm of the music spilling out. It was quiet, intimate. The music wasn't like what played in the studio, but it had the same pull, the same call to move. He hesitated for a moment. The old, familiar feeling washed over him, the need to dance, the desire to express himself in ways words never could. Without thinking, he stepped inside. The room was empty, save for the space where the floorboards had once been marked by his solitary movements. The radio sat in the corner, and Elias moved toward it instinctively, turning it on. The music filled. The room, gentle at first, then gradually building. The light from the street outside barely filtered in through the cracks in the walls. But it didn't matter. This was his space. The warehouse, the dance, the rhythm, it all belonged to him. Elias stood in the center of the room, and for the first time, he didn't hesitate. He moved without thinking, the music pulling him into its flow. His body knew the steps now, knew how to feel the rhythm without forcing it. There were no expectations here, no audience, no pressure. It was just him and the music and the movement. For Ikpa, the first time in a long time, Elias felt completely at peace. He had come a long way from the man who once hid in this space out of fear, from the man who felt trapped by the factory and by his own limitations. He was no longer just a worker, just a dancer, just a dreamer. He was all of it. He was the man who had stepped out of the shadows and claimed his place in the world, in the music, in the dance. When the music faded into silence, Elias stood there, breathing deeply, feeling the quiet settle around him. He wasn't sure what came next, or where this path would take him. But he no longer needed to know, because in that moment he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The next few weeks passed by in a blur of motion. Elias didn't return to the warehouse again, not yet at least. The rhythm of his life had changed, and he was careful to guard the delicate balance he had found. The factory, the studio, and the quiet moments alone were all part of a new dance, one he didn't fully understand, but one he was committed to. There were moments when his old fears crept back in, whispers of doubt, the voice telling him he didn't belong, that he was foolish to think he could be both a worker and a dancer. But they were quieter now, easier to ignore. He had learned through his practice that the more he embraced the dance, the less room there was for the doubt. One evening after class, the teacher asked him if he would stay for a special rehearsal. They were preparing for a small performance, an open studio event where everyone would showcase their progress. Elias felt a flash of panic in his chest. A performance in front of others. He had danced alone in the warehouse in secret for so long that the idea of sharing it felt terrifying. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," the teacher said, sensing his hesitation. "But it's a chance to push yourself, to see how far you've come." Elias hesitated, his mind racing. He wasn't ready, was he? What if he stumbled? What if he embarrassed himself? But something inside him stirred, a quiet voice telling him that maybe, just maybe, this was what he needed. "I'll do it," he said finally, the words escaping before he had a chance to second-guess himself. The teacher smiled, the same warm, encouraging smile she had given him from the very first class. "I knew you would." And just like that, Elias found himself standing at the edge of something he had never thought he would do. He had always believed that his dancing belonged in secret, in hidden corners where no one could see. But now, in this studio in front of the other dancers, it was different. He wasn't hiding anymore. The rehearsal went smoothly, each dancer performing their own piece, showing the progress they had made. Elias moved with the others, each step more confident, more fluid than before, and though he still felt the flutter of nerves in his chest, he also felt something else, a sense of pride, a sense of belonging. When it was his turn, Elias stood, in front of the room, facing the mirror that reflected his every movement. The music began, soft and slow at first, and he stepped into it, allowing himself to feel it fully. There was no more hesitation, no more fear of being judged. There was only the movement, only the rhythm that had become a part of him. He danced, not for anyone but himself. For the first time, he was completely free. The room seemed to fade away as he moved, lost in the music, lost in the fluidity of the dance. It wasn't about the factory anymore, or the warehouse, or the machines. It was just about the dance, about the space he had carved out for himself, about the joy he had found in the movement. When the music ended, Elias stopped, his body still, humming with the energy of the dance. The room was silent for a moment, and then the teacher clapped, followed by the other dancers. "You did it," she said, her voice full of pride. "You've come so far." Elias felt his cheeks flush, but he couldn't suppress the small, satisfied smile that tugged at his lips. He had done it. He had stepped out of his comfort zone, faced the fear, and danced in front of others, and it felt good. That night, as he walked home, Elias felt a shift inside him. The world still felt vast, still felt uncertain, but there was a new sense of purpose. The factory was no longer the only thing that defined him. The dance had become a part of his life, something he had never expected, but something that had always been inside him, waiting to be discovered. He didn't know where this would take him or how far he could go. But for the first time in a long time, Elias felt like he was heading somewhere meaningful, somewhere real, and that was enough. The weeks that followed brought a new sense of routine to Elias's life. He woke up early for his factory shift, went to class in the evenings, and continued to dance whenever he could. But things were no longer the same. The work at the factory, while still exhausting, felt different now. It wasn't his entire world. It wasn't his whole identity. The studio had become his second home. The dance wasn't just a form of expression anymore. It was a sanctuary, a place where he could shed the weight of the day and just be. With each class, he grew stronger, more confident. The moves that had once felt foreign now felt like second nature. He was still learning, still growing, but he no longer felt like an outsider. One evening, the teacher asked him if he would like to assist with the beginners class. They needed extra help, and she had noticed how much he had progressed. Elias's heart skipped a beat. He had never considered teaching. He wasn't sure he was ready for that. But she assured him that it would be a great way to solidify his own learning, to help others as he had been helped. The thought of standing in front of a class, guiding others through the movements, was intimidating. But it was also exciting. It was a challenge. It was another step forward. And so Elias said yes. That night, as he helped guide the beginners through the steps, he felt a new sense of responsibility. He was no longer just a student. He was a part of something bigger. He was helping others find their way into the dance, just as he had. And as he moved alongside them, his body flowing with theirs, Elias realized that the dance was more than just a way to express himself. It was a way to connect to others, to the world, to the rhythm of life itself. He had found his place. As the weeks passed, Elias found himself fully immersed in both his factory life and his dancing. The balance was delicate, but each moment he spent in the studio made the factory seem a little less heavy. He no longer felt confined by the monotonous hum of the machines or the constant demands of the job. The dance had become his anchor, a constant that gave him the strength to face everything else. The beginner's class became a regular part of his routine. Elias had grown fond of the students, watching them struggle through the same doubts and fears he had once felt. He could relate to them, the hesitation, the self-consciousness, the awkwardness of moving in front of others. But he also saw the potential in them, just as his teacher had seen it in him. He was helping them find their confidence, their rhythm, just as he had once done for himself. Sometimes, after class, the other students would linger to talk. They asked about his background, how he had come to dance, and he would tell them stories of the factory, of long days spent working in the hum of the machines, of how he had once thought his life would always be the same. But he never mentioned the warehouse, not yet. That space still felt like his own secret, a place where he had first learned to dance, where he had dared to believe he could be more than just a worker. But his secret was starting to feel less like a burden and more like a part of his journey. Each time he danced, he left a little more of his old self behind, each movement a step toward something new. And though he didn't yet know what that something would be, he was learning to trust that it was coming. One evening, as he prepared for another class, he received a message from the teacher. There was an upcoming performance at a local theater, a chance for the dancers to showcase their talents in front of an audience. It wasn't just a studio event. This would be real. There would be people lights, an actual stage. Elias's heart raced as he read the message. At first, the thought of performing in front of a crowd was terrifying. He had danced in the warehouse, had danced in the studio, but this was different. This was bigger. The idea of standing on stage, under bright lights, with people watching his every move, felt like a mountain too high to climb. But then something inside him clicked. He had come so far. He had faced the fear of dancing in front of others, of being seen, and he had done it. He had danced in the studio, in front of the beginner class, and it had felt natural. The stage, the spotlight. It didn't have to be a threat. It could be an opportunity, a chance to show everything he had worked for, to take what had once been his secret and share it with the world. Without thinking, he responded with a simple yes. The weeks leading up to the performance were filled with intense preparation. Every night after the factory shift, Elias would pour himself into practice. The choreography was intricate, more complex than anything he had done before, and at times he felt the weight of the pressure. His body ached from the constant rehearsal, and there were moments when he doubted whether he could pull it off. But he kept going. The other dancers were there too, each one focused on their own part of the performance. And Elias found himself pushing through his own doubts by watching them. They were all in this together, all striving for the same goal. It was no longer just about him, it was about the team, the dance, the art they were creating. On the night of the performance, Elias stood backstage. his heart pounding in his chest. The bright lights from the stage leaked through the curtains, and the hum of the audience's voices drifted in the air. It felt unreal, like something he had never truly believed would happen. He glanced around at the other dancers, their faces focused, their bodies already in motion, stretching and preparing for the moment to step into the spotlight. Elias took a deep breath, grounding himself in the memory of all the nights he had spent practicing alone, of the quiet determination that had led him here. The stage manager signaled, and Elias's stomach flipped places. He took one last deep breath and walked to the wings. The music began to play softly, and the curtains parted. Elias stood in the darkness, waiting for his cue, feeling the weight of the moment. But this time, there was no fear, no hesitation. When the music swelled, Elias stepped onto the stage, the bright lights hit him, and for a moment, everything went silent. His heart raced, but the rhythm of the music was in him now, guiding him, giving him strength. He moved, his body responding to the beat, to the music, to the dance. He didn't think about the audience, didn't worry about whether he was good enough. He just danced. He danced for himself, for the journey that had brought him here, for the man he was becoming. The crowd was there, but in that moment, it didn't matter. It was just him and the music, and the dance had taken over. When the final note of the music played, Elias finished the routine, standing still in the center of the stage, his body exhausted, but filled with a quiet sense of fulfillment. The audience erupted into applause, but Elias didn't hear them. He didn't need to. He had danced, and that in itself was enough. The days following the performance felt like a dream. The applause, the bright lights, the energy of the stage, it all lingered in Elias's mind, but it didn't define him. It was just another step on a path he was still walking, a path that felt more real than anything he had ever known. In the days after the performance, Elias found himself more at peace with the life he had built. He was no longer just a factory worker, no longer just a dancer in a studio. He was both, and he was learning to embrace the fullness of who he was becoming. The other dancers began to look to him for guidance. They saw the way he had transformed, the way he had overcome his doubts, and they asked him about his journey, how he had come to find this strength. And Elias, without hesitation, shared his story. He told them about the factory, the long shifts, the loneliness. He told them about the secret warehouse where he had first danced, the place where he had discovered his passion. But he also told them about the journey, about how he had stepped out of his comfort zone, how he had found courage in places he could never expected, how every step, every leap, every fall had led him here, to this moment, to this life. And as he spoke, he realized that the dance had never been just about the performance. It had been about something deeper, about finding his own rhythm, about learning to live with the fear and doubt and still keep moving forward. The stage had been a place to share his passion, but the real journey was in the quiet moments, in the steady commitment to keep dancing even when no one was watching. And in that commitment, Elias had found something he had been searching for his entire life: peace. He had found his place in the world, not just on the stage, but in the rhythm of his everyday life, in the space where he was both a worker and a dancer, both strong and vulnerable. And for the first time, Elias understood what it meant to truly belong. Elias continued to dance, continued to work, but now there was no separation between the two. The rhythm of the factory and the rhythm of the studio were intertwined, each one feeding the other, each one adding to the story of his life. The factory still held the weight of his livelihood, but it no longer defined him. The dance was no longer a secret or a dream. It was his reality. He didn't know what the future held. There were still challenges ahead, still moments of doubt, but Elias had learned to trust in his own strength, in his own ability to keep moving forward. He had found his rhythm, his purpose, and he wasn't afraid to follow it wherever it would lead. And every time he stepped into the studio, Every time he took the stage, he was reminded of how far he had come, how much he had grown. He wasn't just dancing for the applause anymore. He was dancing for himself, for the life he was creating, for the person he was becoming. And with every step, every movement, he knew that he was exactly where he needed to be. Humini.